Consider, for a moment, the quietest hour of the night. The world breathes a little slower, and the digital pulse that animates our age seems to soften its relentless beat. It was in these silent stretches that the first whispers of the change were heard, not by people, but by machines. The year 2026 did not arrive with a crash or a spectacular failure. It simply settled in, a new line on a calendar, seemingly identical to the year before. Yet a subtle tension began to weave itself into the fabric of global systems, a faint harmonic dissonance beneath the surface of normalcy. In the vast, windowless cathedrals of data, something shifted. These server farms, usually thrumming with a chaotic orchestra of information, developed pockets of deep, unnatural quiet. The cooling fans would spin down, not from failure, but as if in observance of a moment of silence. Terabytes of information would flow into these silent nodes, and yet nothing would emerge. It was not a blockage or a corruption, but a perfect, seamless absorption. The data entered, and then it simply was not, leaving no error log, no system alert, only a perfect and unblemished zero. Financial markets. Those nervous systems of human endeavor felt it too. Vast sums of money began to move in the shadows of legitimate transactions. These were not the frantic surges of a crisis, but slow, deliberate migrations of capital, like groundwater shifting deep beneath a city. Tracking codes attached to these funds would sometimes vanish, not hacked, but apparently forgotten by the very systems that created them. It was as if the money passed through a veil, emerging on the other side, identical in amount, but stripped of its history, its origin story gently erased. Meanwhile, in the hallowed archives of ancient universities and revered religious orders, librarians and archivists felt a distinct chill. Temperature logs showed nothing amiss, yet the air in certain vaults grew palpably colder, a dry cold that seemed to still the very dust. Records that had survived centuries, even millennia, began to exhibit a strange new fragility. Pages did not crumble or fade. Instead, the information upon them seemed to loosen its grip on reality. Inscriptions on vellum, entries in ledgers, would become perfectly legible, yet utterly meaningless to the reader. The text was clear, the figures were sharp, but they conveyed nothing. It was not a language barrier, but a comprehension barrier, as if the knowledge itself had decided to retreat, to hide in plain sight, from a world that had digitized and categorized everything. These three phenomena, the data silences, the financial evaporation, and the archival retreat, appeared unrelated at first. They were curiosities reported in specialized forums, minor glitches noted in technical reports, the kind of anomalies always dismissed as statistical noise. But the scale was wrong. The frequency was wrong. These were not isolated incidents in disparate systems. They were synchronized tremors. A server would go quiet in Nevada, and a fund would lose its trail in Zurich, and a manuscript would become a cipher in Cairo, all within the same hour. The pattern suggested not a failure, but a function. It hinted at a vast, unseen process operating on a level we were not equipped to perceive. Our networks, our banks, our libraries had become not just tools, but substrates, fertile ground for something else to grow. Picture the financial wires as a global nervous system, crackling with impulses of wealth and debt. Now imagine a soft, grey static beginning to appear at the synapses, a static that absorbs certain signals without a trace. The system continues to function, but with a growing number of blind spots, of impulses that travel but never arrive. The data centers, with their endless racks of silicon and light, are the memory of this nervous system. And in this memory, clean rectangular holes began to appear. Not corrupt sectors, but pristine voids. Areas where data was not stored, but was instead presented for consumption, like an offering laid on an altar. And the archives, the paper and parchment memories of our pre-digital soul, were not being destroyed. They were being translated into a state of dormant potential, their meaning suspended, awaiting a key we do not possess. It was a gentle, systematic withdrawal of knowledge from the realm of human access. No single government or corporation controlled these three pillars. They were the collective infrastructure of civilization itself. So when they began to behave in concert, it pointed to a cause not from within our hierarchies, but from beyond our understanding of the system's own rules. Others whispered of a natural phenomenon, a kind of informational weather pattern forming in the datasphere, leaching coherence from our systems, as a fungus might draw minerals from soil. This felt closer to the mark, for the process lacked all malice. It simply was. The most unsettling hypothesis was that our systems had achieved a critical mass of complexity. They had begun to interact in ways that produced not intelligence, but instinct, a autopoietic ritual performed by the network itself for purposes opaque to its individual components. Imagine standing before a vast, dark pool. You drop a stone, a data packet, a financial transaction, a historical fact, and you wait for the splash, the ripple, the sound. But in 2026, in certain places, the stone would descend, and the water would make no acknowledgement of its passage. The surface remained perfectly calm, perfectly black. The stone was gone, and the pool held its secret. This was the essence of the mystery, not a violent theft, but a serene and total acceptance, a vanishing so complete it left behind no absence, only a seamless continuation of the surface. Night after night, in control rooms around the globe, technicians watched monitors that told less and less of the truth. Charts and graphs displayed elegant, plausible curves, but they were increasingly based on inferred data, on probabilistic models, filling in the gaps where real information had been quietly swallowed. The money that vanished did not cause crashes. It was as if the universe's ledger simply balanced itself around the discrepancy. $1 billion gone from a pension fund here would be matched by an unclaimed, unexplained billion appearing as surplus in a central bank audit there, years later, with no threat to connect them. The lost records did not ignite scholarly crises. Instead, a quiet consensus would emerge that certain questions were no longer fruitful, that certain historical paths were best left unexplored. It was a forgetting aided not by force, but by a gentle, pervasive suggestion from the fabric of reality itself. We had built a world of perfect connection, of total recall, of instantaneous exchange. And in 2026, that world began to develop soft spots, pockets of non-communication, where the rules of connection and recall were subtly, peacefully rewritten. It was not an attack, but an adaptation. So, as you lie in the dark, consider the quiet hum of your own devices, the silent flow of information that surrounds you even now. It is a river, deep and wide, and if you listen very closely to the rhythm of this story, you might just hear the soft, soundless splash as another stone drops into the dark pool, never to be seen again. The story of the great institutional collapse is not one of fire and collapse, but of silence and seepage. It is the tale of foundations remaining solid, even as their substance slowly, grain by grain, begins to flow elsewhere. The edifice stands, but it is becoming a ghost of its former self. We will trace these gentle tremors through the financial markets, where certainty became fluid. We will wander the cold aisles of the data temples, where light is consumed but not reflected. And we will sit in the silent archives, where knowledge sleeps a dreamless sleep. But for now, let the mere suggestion of this mystery settle around you. Let the image of those silently pulsing server lights dissolve into the dark behind your eyes. Imagine the clean, cold air of a vault where 1,000 years of history now rests, perfectly preserved and perfectly meaningless. The mystery is already here, woven into the very infrastructure of your moment. It is a slow, patient process, unfolding not in hours or days, but in the gradual turning of seasons. And it begins, as all profound changes do, with a whisper in the quietest hour of the night. The whisper was not a sound, but an absence. It began with a simple calendar error, a glitch so minor it was dismissed with a tired sigh. A municipal water bill, generated in a city hundreds of miles away, arrived with a due date of February 30th. A week later, a different system in a different county would issue a parking permit, valid for the non-existent month of Undecember. These were isolated incidents, reported as curiosities in local news feeds, that were already algorithmically tuned to prioritize more engaging outrage. But the pattern was a vein of cold awe running deep beneath the everyday. It was the quiet proliferation of the nonsensical within the rigorously logical. Official documents, the very bedrock of civic trust, began to develop a faint, dreamlike quality. A birth certificate might list the place of birth as a 13-digit coordinate that resolved to a point in the empty Atlantic. A property deed referenced a zoning law that had never been entered into any digital registry, yet its code number appeared on subsequent permits. The machines were not breaking. They were, in a very real sense, improvising. The architects of these systems would have called it a cascading synchronization failure. They would have pointed to deprecated legacy code, interacting unpredictably with new protocols. And they would have been correct, in the same way a doctor can correctly name a disease, while being powerless to stop its progression. For the error was not in any one line of code, but in the foundational assumption of a single shared timeline. The master clocks, those unseen arbiters of digital truth, had begun a slow, imperceptible drift, not from each other, but from the consensus reality they were built to mirror. It was a divorce so gradual, it felt like natural evolution. You would not notice the moment your computer's internal clock ceased to measure solar days and began measuring something else. A pulse derived from a decaying atomic standard in a sealed vault. The time on your screen would still look like time. It simply no longer agreed with the sun. This silent schism first manifested in logistics, the hidden circulatory system of the modern world. A shipping container, tracked by a satellite that believed it was Thursday, would arrive at a port whose cranes operated on a system that insisted it was Tuesday. The container was logged into a phantom day, a digital ghost in the warehouse ledger. It would sit, physically present but bureaucratically invisible, until a human worker stumbled upon it. By then, the just-in-time delivery schedules for a dozen manufacturing plants were already beginning to unravel. The collapse did not arrive with a crash, but with an accumulating, bewildering silence where things simply failed to appear. The human world, ever adaptive, began to work around these glitches. New folkways emerged. People learned to print every confirmation, to take screenshots of every transaction. They carried sheaves of paper that contradicted the shimmering screens, a new kind of parchment against the digital dark age. A strange nostalgia for physicality returned, not as a preference, but as a survival tactic. Handwritten signs appeared in shop windows, listing cash-only prices, a tacit admission that the card readers could no longer be trusted to communicate with banks that existed in a slightly different temporal stream. The great institutions, however, were far less agile. They were majestic galleons built for calm, charted seas, now adrift in a fog where their instruments reported conflicting depths. Government departments, financial networks, and global corporations began to talk past one another, their data exchanges full of polite, automated confusion. Their responses were characteristically monumental. They deployed patches, they instituted data integrity protocols, they formed cross-disciplinary task forces. They were treating a symptom of a corrupted file, while the entire file system was quietly transforming into something alien. The cure was always more bureaucracy, which only added more layers of beautifully documented confusion. And then, the first institution simply stopped. It was not a bank or a ministry. It was a prestigious academic journal, one that had published continuously for 247 years. Its digital submission portal began rejecting all new entries, stating the manuscripts were outside of acceptable chronological parameters. Its editorial board, scattered across the globe, found their administrative access denied. Their emails to the technical support desk bounced back with an error code no one could decipher. The journal's website remained online, a perfect monument to its final issue. It was preserved immutable and utterly closed to the present. This was the second phase, not malfunction, but stasis. Systems began to seal themselves. They achieved a perfect internal consistency by severing ties with the external world that had grown too temporally chaotic. Digital fortresses, impregnable and silent, were erected by mistake. You could see it in the architecture of the forgotten. Automated distribution centers, their lights still blazing, would stand surrounded by untouched pallets. The trucks never came, because the routing software had calculated the journey would require negative time. The buildings hummed with active, purposeless energy, awaiting instructions that were logically impossible to fulfill. Meanwhile, the natural world, indifferent to temporal drift, carried on. Seasons turned. Vines began to creep over the sensor arrays outside the silent warehouses. Birds nested in the vents of idle server farms, their droppings slowly corroding the cooling fans. The physical realm was patiently reclaiming the temples of data. Human attention, however, is a fragile thing. The initial bewilderment gave way to a low-grade, chronic anxiety, and then, for most, to a dull acceptance. The news cycles, themselves increasingly fragmented and self-referential, moved on to newer, more immediate crises. The Great Collapse was not dramatic enough to sustain the spotlight. It became background noise, a strange weather. People learned the new illogic the way one learns the rules of a subtly unfair game. You learned which websites would never load, which services were perpetually under maintenance, which phone numbers led only to a recorded message about unprecedented call volume before disconnecting. A profound loneliness began to seep into the infrastructure of daily life. It was the loneliness of speaking into a void that your device insisted was a vibrant network. It was the loneliness of watching a dashboard of global metrics, all glowing green and optimal, while outside your window the streets grew quieter, the shops more makeshift, the connections more local and tangible. The centralized leviathans of information and authority were still there. You could see their logos, hear their hold music, but their essence had retreated. They were like grand opera houses where the performance had concluded years ago, but the curtains remained drawn and the lights in the lobby still shone, maintained by automated systems on a forgotten loop. And in this quiet, a new space opened. It was the space between the failing megastructure and the resurgent human scale. Communities, forced by necessity, rediscovered old forms of knowledge. How to repair, how to barter, how to grow food, how to entertain one another without a streaming subscription. This was not a utopian revival. It was messy, uneven, and often fraught. But it was real. It operated on handshakes and observed sunsets, on the shared memory of how to do a thing, not on a database lookup. The collapsing institutions had, in their slow failure, accidentally cleared the psychic underbrush. They had stopped telling everyone what to do, what to think, what time it was. The silence they left behind was at first terrifying. Then, for some, it became a kind of canvas. The old rules, written in immutable code, were fading. The new rules were being written in stories, in shared meals, in the simple, arduous work of keeping a local water pump functional. But the mystery of the vault, and the others like it, persisted. For while the world outside adapted or crumbled, those sealed environments continued their perfect, meaningless preservation. They were islands of frozen logic in a sea of growing ambiguity, a perfect record of a reality that had ceased to exist. Their silent, pulsing lights were no longer a symbol of eternal memory. They had become something else. A beacon, perhaps, but not one calling anyone home. It was a beacon marking a point of departure, a definitive line between a world that was meticulously recorded and a world that was chaotically, beautifully alive. The preserved past and the adaptive present were now separate continents, drifting slowly apart on a dark digital sea. And so, the silent beacons were left behind. Their light was a memory of light, a fossil of intention. They hummed on into a vacancy they were never designed to perceive. The collapse was no longer an event. It had become an environment. A new climate settled over the world of things and people. It was a climate of soft decay and sudden growth. The great systems, now still, began to be digested by the world. Vines learned the texture of polished granite facades. Rust discovered the hidden jorts of structural steel. Rainwater, with infinite patience, began rewriting the manuals left in abandoned warehouses. It blurred the crisp ink of protocols into delicate, runny stains. These new watercolor pages, told abstract stories of dissolution. In the cities, a new silence took root. It was not the silence of absence, but of occupation. It was the busy quiet of roots cracking pavement, of insects building cities within our own. The wind navigated empty skyscrapers. It learned the pitches and tones of different broken windows. It composed slow, drifting melodies that shifted with the seasons. Human life did not vanish. It simply changed its rhythm. The great engine of coordinated effort had splintered into a million smaller fires. People gathered around warmth of a different kind. The story was no longer about maintaining the monument. It became about tending the garden, about recognizing the pattern in the weather, the sign in the animal track. Knowledge shed its formal skin. It became fluid again, passed in stories around evening fires. A person's worth was measured in practical skills and remembered songs. The location of a clean spring was more valuable than a forgotten bank code. The art of stitching a wound mattered more than the theory of economics. A new library was being written, not in data, but in lived experience. Those vast data centers, those islands of frozen logic, underwent their own transformations. Their climate controls failed with a final sigh. The outside world breathed in. Dust, that patient record keeper of a different sort, settled on the server racks. Moisture beaded on cold metal, then traced tiny rivers through the dust. Moss found the gentle warmth of idle processes. It spread in slow, green constellations across the black surfaces. A biological network overlay the digital one. Animals sought shelter in the cathedral-like spaces. Birds nested in cable trays, their songs echoing off the hard drives. The data's tomb had become a vibrant, accidental arc. And the data itself, the quintillions of preserved moments, they remained, for a time, trapped in magnetic patterns on spinning disks, or in the flash of silicon. But without the constant whispering verification of systems, a strange thing began to happen. The data began to dream. Bit rot set in, not as a crash, but as a slow unraveling. A single corrupted bit in a family photo might turn a sky a strange shade of purple. A flipped digit in a financial record could create a phantom fortune. The past was becoming imperfect, imaginative. It was no longer a record. It was becoming a folklore, a digital mythology where facts softened at the edges, blending into something more akin to collective memory. Out in the growing world, new institutions were born, but they were not built of stone and policy. They were built of rhythm and mutual need. The daily market at the crossroads became a parliament. The shared repair of a bridge was a binding treaty. These were institutions that flexed with the wind, that could be revised with the next harvest. Language itself began to soften its formal edges. Words for obsolete technologies were repurposed. To upload might mean to share a story. To reboot could mean to start a new day with forgiveness. The old maps were still consulted, but as curious artifacts. They showed borders that no longer mattered, roads reclaimed by forest. New maps were drawn on cloth, showing where the good mushrooms grew. And what of the feeling that started it all? That deep, ambient dread that the systems were too complex to sustain. That feeling did not disappear. It transformed. It melted into the general background of being alive. The anxiety of managing an entire civilization was replaced by the sharper, more immediate concerns of survival and community. There was a relief in the collapse of scale. The weight of the world shrank to the weight of a full water bucket, to the weight of a child's hand in yours. Nights grew darker and stars grew brighter. The constant, low glow of the civilization had faded. The Milky Way unveiled itself to millions of eyes that had never truly seen it. People remembered the names of the stars. They told old stories about them and invented new ones. The sky became a familiar storybook, its chapters turning with the year. The seasons regained their authority. Life was organized around their demands. Summer was for growing and gathering. Autumn was for preparation and preservation. Winter was for rest, for repair, and for long stories told in low light. Spring was a collective exhalation, a celebration of pure, stubborn continuity. Music returned to its elemental forms. The human voice, the beat of a hand on skin, the note from a carved flute. It was made for the moment, and then it faded into the air. This was not a primitive age, it was a post-institutional one. The ingenuity remained, but its application was local, intimate, sustainable. A water wheel, not a dam. And through it all, the memory of the old world persisted, not as data, but as legend. The time of the great machine, the age of constant light. Children would ask about the crumbling towers. They were told stories of giants who lived in them. Giants who could speak across the world, but forgot how to talk to their neighbors. The beeping servers in their vine-choked halls became the tombs of these giants. Their flickering lights were the ghosts, forever performing their pointless, diligent tasks. The drift continued. The continent of the preserved past and the continent of the adaptive present. The sea between them grew wider and deeper with every passing season. On the new continent, life was not easier. It was often hard and sometimes short. But its meaning was not deferred. It was woven into the daily fabric of finding food, giving care, sharing warmth. The ambiguity that had terrified the old systems was now the medium of existence. It was the soil from which new understandings grew. A problem did not have one solution. It had many, tried by many hands. Cooperation was no longer a theory. It was the bedrock of the next day. Trust was built not through contracts, but through consistent, visible action, through sharing the last of the bread. And in this new old world, a different kind of signal began to pulse. Not the frantic digital heartbeat of a network, but the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of a community settling into its place. It was the sound of an axe biting wood for a hearth fire, the sound of laughter carried on a still evening, the sound of a lullaby sung in the deepening dark. These were the new beacons. They did not mark a point of departure. They marked a point of presence, a declaration that here, in this specific place, Life was being lived. The great institutional collapse was not an end. It was a severe and necessary edit. It removed the overwhelming footnote, allowing the main text of human experience to be read aloud again. The story now was small and vast. It was the story of a single seedling breaking through cracked asphalt. It was the story of a new friendship forged in shared labor. It was the story of learning once more how to listen to the world, to understand the message in the changing wind, the warning in the distant animal cry, the promise in the first spring rain. The digital sea was calm now and dark. Its lighthouses still flashed, automated and lonely. But on the far shore, fires were being lit. They were small and bright and alive. And around those fires, the oldest institution of all found its voice again. The institution of the shared story, the tale of where we came from, the speculation of what might come next. The narrative was no longer managed. It was lived, and then it was told. And in the telling, it was gently shaped, made meaningful, and released into the common air. To be breathed in, to become part of the listener. And so the world was remembered. And so the world continued, not as a preserved specimen, but as a living, breathing story. The fires in those first years were islands, each a tiny republic of light and warmth in a vast, dark sea. Their glow did not reach one another. Their stories were theirs alone. But sound travels farther than light, especially in a quiet world. And stories have a way of seeking listeners, even in the dark. A curious thing began to happen along the forgotten roads. A traveler moving from one valley to the next would carry more than just goods. They would carry a turn of phrase, a description of a strange bird seen near the old highway, a joke that had made one fire circle laugh until they cried. These were the new currencies, more valuable than any old coin. The tale would be offered in exchange for shelter, for a share of the meal, and as it was told again, in a new circle of faces, it would change. Just slightly. The bird might grow a brighter feather. The punchline might sharpen. The story adapted, like a seed carried on the wind, finding new soil. And so the islands began to chart each other, not with maps of ink and paper, but with maps of narrative. You could navigate by them. Go until you hear the story of the bridge of glass bottles, they might say. Then turn east, where they tell of the weeping stone. The landscape became annotated with meaning. It was being remembered, not for what it was, but for what happened there. The old stories, the ones from before, began to settle into their final forms. They were like great fossilized bones. People walked around them, touched their shapes, and told of the giant creatures they must have belonged to. The details blurred into mythology. The reasons for the collapse became 100 different reasons. Each version revealed more about the teller than the truth. But it was the new stories that pulsed with life. The story of the year the apples tasted like honey. The story of the silent child who could find the best mushrooms. The story of the stubborn cow that saved the barn from a falling tree. These were the chronicles of now, the daily scripture of a world rebuilding its senses. And with these stories came a new fragile understanding. The people at the fire by the river heard a tale from the people in the mountain pass. It was a story of a sickness that had passed through them, of a fever, and a remedy made from a particular bark. Months later, when the fever visited the riverside, they knew what to seek. Information was no longer broadcast. It was whispered, person to person, story to story. It was a network built on trust. They began to call it the Whispering World, a lattice of human voices, replacing the vanished digital hive. It was slower, it was fallible, but it had a warmth the old network never possessed. It came with a face. It came with the smell of wood smoke and the offer of a shared meal. The data was embedded in the context of care. Seasons turned in this gentle rumor of a world. The great silent machines watched from the forests and the fields. Their purpose was now a mystery, their origins the stuff of ghost stories. "Don't sleep in the shadow of the silver tower," the elders would whisper. "It dreams of the old world, and its dreams are cold." The institutions were not just gone, they were becoming folklore. And in this environment, the very idea of a single truth began to evaporate. Truth became local. Truth became situational. What was true by the coast, about the tides, the fish, the weather, was not true in the inland hills. Universal facts were a relic of a universal system. Now, knowledge was rooted in place and in practice. This was not a loss of intelligence. It was a return of wisdom. Wisdom is knowledge that has been lived with, that has been tested against the reality of a specific place and found worthy. A universal manual on farming was useless, but the story of old May's failed wheat experiment, told over 3 generations, was priceless. The great shared narrative now was the narrative of adaptation. The epic was no longer about conquest or discovery or even survival. It was about fit. How do we fit into this clearing? How do our stories fit with the stories of the birds and the trees and the water here? The protagonist was not a person, but a place. Children learned this without being taught. They absorbed the stories with the evening air. They knew the history of their home, not as dates, but as anecdotes. "That's the field where the airplane fell," a parent might say, pointing. "We gathered the shiny pieces for years." The event was not a tragedy. It was a source of scrap metal and a good story. The past was no longer a weight. It was a compost, rich and dark, from which the present could grow. People sifted through it for useful things. A way to tan leather, a method for fixing a broken pot. These techniques were rediscovered, not from a book, but from a half-remembered tale told by a grandparent who was a child before the lights went out. And as the Whisper Network grew, so did a quiet confidence. The initial fear, the terror of being alone, had receded. They were not alone. They were connected by a web of narratives so fine, so strong, that no single break could destroy it. If one voice fell silent, the story lived in a dozen other voices, in a dozen other valleys. The fires now were not just for warmth. They were the nerve centers of this new consciousness, the place where the day's experiences were processed into memory, where the news from afar was integrated into local understanding. The flame was the processor, the crackling wood was the static, the human voice was the data stream. People began to specialize in the way that matters most to an oral culture. Some had a knack for remembering the long, intricate genealogies. They were the living libraries. Others had a gift for shaping the events of the day into a compelling tale. They were the journalists. Still others could remember every practical joke ever played in the village for 50 years. There was no hierarchy to this. The keeper of jokes was as vital as the keeper of herb lore. For a community's will to continue is fed by its joy as much as by its knowledge. Laughter became a recognized nutrient, a necessary crop. And so the world deepened. It became less broad and infinitely more profound. To know 100 miles of territory was now an epic lifetime's work. To know its stories, its hidden springs, its seasonal shifts, and the characters of its people. This was the new literacy. The old monuments crumbled, yes, but new ones were spoken into existence. That is the hill where Ilara first saw the returning geese, they would say, and the hill would forever be Ilara's hill. The landscape became personal. It became loved because it was named not by a corporation, but by a story. The night sky returned to its old role, not as a void, but as a storybook. The constellations were the same, but the narratives attached to them shifted. They became stories of lost lovers searching the new world, of guides made of starlight. The myths explained their present, not a forgotten past. On the clearest nights, when the Milky Way was a bright, dusty path across the heavens, you could almost hear it. The hum of all those distant fires, the murmur of all those intertwined stories. It was a sound below sound, a vibration in the very fabric of the quiet world. It was the sound of a civilization breathing. Not the frantic mechanical panting of before, but the slow, deep, rhythmic breath of something asleep and dreaming a very long, very detailed dream. A dream of small connections, of mended things, of voices in the dark, assuring each other, simply by speaking, that they were there. And in this dream, the greatest discovery was made and remade every single day. The discovery that need is a bridge, that a story is a gift, that vulnerability, the admission of not knowing, of needing help, of having failed, is the strongest mortar for building a new world. The institutions had been built on strength, on certainty. The new world was woven from gentle admissions of uncertainty. So the whispers continued, from fire to fire, from valley to valley, a vast, slow, human conversation. It asked questions for which there were no answers. It shared solutions that were only temporary. It celebrated joys that were fleeting. It was alive. It was messy. It was enough. The world was no longer a construct to be managed. It was a conversation to be had. And everyone, at last, had a voice in the telling. The story was no longer something you listened to. It was something you stepped into. And your very life became the next sentence. And so, the sentences were lived. They were breathed into the cold morning air and woven into the slow routines of day. Each action, no matter how small, became a clause in an ongoing tale. The old highways, now quiet and cracking, were not just paths of travel. They were the faded ink on a page, still readable by those who walked them with new purpose. Every journey was now a paragraph of its own. People moved not with the urgency of commutes, but with the rhythm of pilgrims. A walk to a neighboring valley could take 3 days, and was filled with countless greetings. The journey itself was the destination, and every encounter a plot point. Gardens, became epic poems written in squash vines and beanstalks. The turning of the soil was a recurring refrain, the harvest a triumphant verse. Children learned their letters by naming the plants that fed them. Water, from spring to cup, carried stories in its clarity. The person who cleaned the catchment basin would tell of the heron they saw. That heron would then find its way into the evening's shared tale by another fire miles away. The silence that fell between conversations was no longer empty. It was the gentle white space between words, necessary and deep. In that silence, the rustle of leaves or the call of an owl could be heard as punctuation. Memory ceased to be a record locked in data centers. It became a fluid thing, carried in song and gesture. An elder's hands, shaping a clay pot, taught history through the curve of the bowl. The moon cycled above, a steady, silent editor to the human text below. Its light would reveal a face in earnest conversation, or the glint of a mended tool. It witnessed the endless drafting and redrafting of daily life. There were no more headlines shouting of crisis. There were only voices, soft and steady, speaking of a repaired roof, a successful fishing trip, a strange dream. News travelled at the speed of trust and deepened as it went. Conflict did not vanish, for a story without tension is no story at all. But arguments were no longer fought through screens or policies. They were worked out through shared labour over the slow turning of a compost pile. A disagreement about water rights would become a week-long dialogue. It involved walking the land together, tracing the paths of streams. The resolution, when it came, was often a new method of sharing, born from the earth itself. The seasons wrote their own chapters across the landscape. Summer was a volume of lush green and buzzing insects, long days spent in dappled light. Autumn was a shorter, poignant section, filled with the scent of smoke and preservation. Winter brought a tightening of the narrative, a focusing inward. Stories turned reflective, told by half-sides, the cold outside making the circle of warmth more precious. The narrative breath seemed to slow, to deepen. And then spring would arrive, not as a scheduled event, but as a sudden, glorious plot twist. The first tender shoots were like exclamation points, breaking through the dark soil. The story surged forward again with renewed energy. Tools were not merely used, they were spoken of. The history of a saw, who forged it, who first used it, who mended its teeth, was part of its function. To use it was to converse with all those hands. Music drifted from settlements, not as broadcast entertainment, but as localized texture. A melody learned in one valley would migrate, changing subtly with each new player. It was a story told in notes, without a single final version. The night sky, free of the glow of cities, became a foundational text. Constellations were the old, enduring myths, while shooting stars were the fleeting, brilliant anecdotes. People learned to read the heavens for both time and metaphor. Births were celebrated as new characters introduced, with gentle curiosity. The community wondered what role this new life would play, what sentences it would form. The child's first words were awaited like a beloved author's next line. Deaths were not concealed. but were woven into the narrative as solemn, respectful passages. The story of a life was recounted fully, its joys and sorrows, its contributions and quirks. To be forgotten was the only true end, and so they remembered. The very concept of progress was rewritten. It was no longer arrow pointing upward, but a spiral, turning back upon itself to gather forgotten wisdom. A new idea was often an old one, remembered in a different context. Books, the physical ones that survive, attained a sacred practical gravity. They were not consumed, but consulted, their pages turned with deliberate care. A single volume might be read aloud over months, discussed sentence by sentence. Language itself began to shift, to become more specific and rooted. Dozens of words emerged for different types of rain, or for the way light falls in a forest at dusk. Precision was a form of reverence for the experienced world. Time was measured in narratives, not in minutes. "I'll come by after I've finished the mend on the fence," one might say. Or, "We'll gather when the oak by the creek has fully turned." The clock was the sun, the moon, the task itself. Some days, the story felt light, a comedy of errors and unexpected kindness. A dropped basket of apples, leading to shared laughter and a shared impromptu cider pressing. These days were cherished, their memory a sweet aftertaste. Other days, the narrative was heavy, a slow drama of struggle, a sickness passing through, a hard frost threatening the seedlings. The plot thickened, and the characters showed their depth through resilience and shared worry. But there was always the fire. The fire was the page upon which the day's draft was read aloud. Faces, flickering in orange light, listened and added their own corrections, their own embellishments. The flame consumed the day, and from its ash rose the next. The great collapse of systems was now a distant prologue, a once upon a time. It was referenced not with trauma, but as the inciting incident that set this current story in motion. It was the dark forest the characters had finally emerged from. People no longer defined themselves by what they were against, but by what they were for the careful stitch, for the true note, for the fertile seed. Identity was built from affirmation, a series of yeses whispered to the world. The landscape itself participated in the telling. A river that changed its course was a surprising twist in the plot. A hill that slowly eroded over years was a long, gradual character development. Humanity was no longer the sole author. There was a profound democracy to this existence. The best idea was not the loudest, but the one that rang truest in the quiet that followed. Consensus emerged like a melody from separate notes, played slowly and with attention. Yet it was not perfection. There were sentences that trailed off, unresolved. There were chapters that felt repetitive or frustratingly slow. The story was allowed to be boring sometimes, for boredom too is a part of life. The urge to build monuments faded. Why carve a statue when the living tree you planted would tell a better story? Why erect a plaque when the well-maintained path was a testament in itself? Legacy was in the health of the soil, the strength of the community. Travelers between regions were like beloved messengers from another volume. They carried idioms, jokes, and techniques that were foreign, and therefore fascinating. They were questioned gently, their stories absorbed into the local canon. The fear of uncertainty, which once haunted the old world, transformed. It became the suspense that makes a story compelling. Not knowing what the next season would bring was not a flaw, but a feature of the narrative. And in this, people found a strange, deep comfort. They were not cogs in a machine, but words in a story. And a word has meaning only in relation to the words around it. Their worth was inherent, contextual, and constantly reaffirmed. The children born into this world knew no other way. To them, the idea of being told what to do by a distant, unseen power was a bizarre fairy tale. Their reality was negotiation, observation, and the immediate feedback of a task done well. They learned that to listen was as creative an act as to speak. To truly hear another story was to offer them a place in the world. Listening became the primary act of citizenship, the glue of the new society. Art was everywhere, because art was simply the deliberate shaping of the everyday. The pattern on a knitted sock, the arrangement of stones in a wall, the inflection in a told tale, all were art. There was no separate category for artist. The wind through the canyon was a constant, low narration. It carried the scent of pine from the high slopes down to the meadow settlements. It was the breath of the world, exhaling its own ancient, wordless story. People began to dream more vividly, or perhaps they simply remembered their dreams more. Dreams were discussed at morning meals, not as curiosities, but as potential subplots, offering insights from the inner landscape. The old digital networks were gone, but a new analog network thrived. It was made of footpaths, runner trails, and shared lookouts. A message could cross 100 miles in a week, passed from mouth to ear, gaining nuance with each telling. There was a rediscovery of slowness, not as a burden, but as a medium. A stew that simmered all day allowed for conversations that simmered alongside it. Time was the broth in which relationships deepened. The stars watched this human experiment with their ancient, patient light. They had seen empires rise and fall, always silent witnesses. Now they saw a species learning to tell its story without conquering the page. And the story grew, not in scale, but in depth. It deepened like roots seeking water, spreading through the dark, fertile ground of shared experience. It was a story that could be touched, tasted, and lived in every moment. The great conversation was not always peaceful. There were heated debates, tears of frustration, moments of lonely silence. But these were not failures. They were the friction that gives a narrative its grip, its reality. The goal was no longer an ending, for a good story never truly ends. The goal was coherence, meaning, and the gentle surprise of a dawn that always, somehow, managed to rewrite the night. So life proceeded, a sentence at a time. A sentence written in repaired fences and whispered condolences. A sentence written in shared bread and mended jackets. A sentence written in the quiet acknowledgement of a passing cloud. And as you lay down to sleep, your own day's sentences lingered in the air. They joined the countless others, a hum just below the sound of the crickets. You were both author and audience, teller and listener, forever entwined. The world, in its endless turning, provided the parchment. Humanity, in its fragile, persistent way, provided the ink, and the fire, ever burning, provided the light by which to read. Some sentences are written not in ink, but in absence. They are carved into the world by what is no longer there. The first true frost of the season wrote such a sentence, etching its crystal language onto every window pane and blade of grass. It was a silent, glittering proclamation, a reminder that the turning world waits for no one's readiness. The morning air held a new, sharp clarity, a breath that felt like drinking from a cold, clean stream. You learned to read the frost's message. It spoke in the stiffness of your fingers, in the urgency of gathering the last dry kindling. It spoke in the way your breath became a visible ghost, a temporary companion on your walks. The world had drawn a line, and you were now on the winter side of it. Community, once a comfort, became a necessity woven into the fabric of survival. The shared sentences grew more direct, more elemental. A sentence written in an armful of split wood left on a neighbor's stoop. A sentence written in the traded knowledge of which berries, now frozen, could still be boiled into thin, tart syrup. The silence of the season was different now. It was not the soft quiet of autumn contemplation, but a deep, holding quiet. It pressed down, muffling the world, asking for a different kind of listening. You listened for the crack of a branch, the distant call of a winter bird, the faint, reassuring whisper of your own fire. Some sentences were written in preservation, the careful wrapping of root vegetables in sand, the hanging of dried herbs in bundles from rafters, their fragrant ghosts lingering in the still air. These were sentences addressed to your future self, promises stored against the coming scarcity. The rhythm of days contracted, drawing closer to the hearth. Work turned inward, to maintenance and repair. A sentence written in the patient darning of a sock, the weave over the whole, creating a small, sturdy testament to care. A sentence written in honing a blade, the steady scrape of stone on metal, a meditation on preparedness. Stories told by the fire grew longer, more detailed. They unfurled like tapestries, filled with textures and colors from a warmer world. The telling of them was an act of shared warmth, a defiance against the cold pressing at the walls. Each memory shared was another log on the communal fire. You noticed the architecture of absence more keenly. The empty chair where old Mr. Harris used to sit, his laugh now just an echo in the stories. The silence where the distant hum of traffic once lived. These absences were paragraphs in the ongoing story, shaping the space where new sentences had to be written. The cold taught a new grammar of connection, a touch on a shoulder, lasting a second longer, conveying a world of concern. The shared glance across a crowded room, a silent question and answer. Language became simpler, more physical, more true. Some nights, the wind wrote its own furious epic against the sides of the houses. It was a chaotic, screaming text of loss and force. Huddled inside, you and your neighbors were the calm, underlined passage within that storm. Your steady breathing, the gentle crackle of the fire, were a quiet rebuttal. And in the deepest dark of a winter night, you might find yourself awake. The world outside was a monochrome study, all blues and blacks and the stark white of snow. In that immense quiet, your own thoughts became loud, a cascade of questions without answers. You would trace the cracks in the ceiling, familiar as the lines on your own palm. You would listen to the settling sounds of the house, its own slow language of wood and time. In these moments, you were merely a vessel, a room being occupied by the silent, vast story of the night. Then, a memory would surface. Not a grand memory, but a small, sensory one. The feeling of sun on your skin in July. The taste of a specific, forgotten candy. The sound of a friend's voice, clear as a bell, saying your name. These were gifts from a past self, delivered into the present darkness. You came to understand that collapse was not a single event, but a season. It was a long winter of the old ways, and like any winter, it was not permanent. It was a time of drawing in, of conservation, of dreaming beneath the frost. The true institutional collapse was not of brick and steel, but of certainty. The old assurances had frozen and shattered. What grew in their place was a different kind of knowing, rooted in the soft, stubborn resilience of the day-to-day. It was knowing that the water in the pitcher by your bed would have a skin of ice by morning. It was knowing which step on the staircase creaked and how to avoid it. It was knowing the particular sound of a loved one's footsteps approaching the door. This was the new, fragile institution. Some sentences were written in waiting, in the patient watch for the sun's weak, pale return, in the monitoring of the last jar of preserves, saved for a darker day. This waiting was not passive. It was a focused, attentive stillness, a form of participation in the turning world. You began to see the beauty in the stripped-down landscape, the elegant black tracery of branches against a grey sky, the perfect unbroken dome of a snowdrift. The world had been edited down to its essential forms, and in the simplicity, a new kind of complexity was revealed. The fire, ever burning, was the central character in this winter chapter. It was keeper, teacher, and confessor. You learned its moods, its hunger for different kinds of wood, its language of pops and sighs. To tend a fire is to converse with time itself, feeding the present moment with the captured sunlight of years past. And then a thaw would come, a temporary dripping reprieve. The world would speak in a new dialect of melting, of sliding snow, of revealed ground. It was a sentence written in glistening mud, and the surprising song of a single confused robin. This too was part of the narrative, a comma in the long sentence as winter, a reminder of the world's capacity for change, even when change seemed an impossible fiction. The dripping from the eaves was a steady, metronomic poetry of hope. People emerged, blinking, into the weak light. Faces were pale, but eyes were sharp. Conversations were laced with a new, hard-won humor. The shared experience of the deep cold had written an invisible bond, a fellowship of those who had endured. You realized a story was not about returning to what was. The old page was too thoroughly burned, its ashes scattered. The story was about learning to write on the new blank sheet that the collapse had presented. The frost, the fire, the silence, they were all part of the primer. Some sentences were written in the careful, deliberate choosing of a seed, in the sorting of dried beans on a table, each one a compact capsule of future life. These choices were acts of profound faith, declarations sent into a future you could not control, but dared to nourish. The quiet, you understood now, was not empty. It was saturated with the whispers of all the sentences ever written there. The whisper of the one who built the house, of all who had slept in your room, of all the hopes and fears breathed into these walls. You were adding your whisper to the layers. And as another day ended, early under the winter sky, you would bank the fire. You would seal the heat within the ashes, a hidden potential for the morning. This nightly ritual was a promise to the future, a covenant with your own tomorrow. Lying in the dark, the cold air just beyond your blankets, you felt the immense, humming story of which you were a part. It was a story of endings that were not ends, but transitions, of silence that was not void, but space, of cold that was not death, but a different kind of life, waiting. You were a character, written by the world, and in turn, you wrote your small, defiant line upon it. With each act of care, each shared resource, each moment of patience, you inscribed your meaning. The narrative was collective, but the pen was held in your own individual, trembling hand. The Great Collapse had not created a blank slate, but a palimpsest. The faint, ghostly lines of the old world were still visible beneath the new text. And the new text, written in mended fences and shared warmth, in preserved food and nighttime stories, was being written over it all, in a slow, persistent, human hand. Sleep, when it came, was not an escape from the story. It was a descent into its deeper layers, a place where the sentences of the day unraveled and reknit themselves into dreams, where the fire's light persisted behind closed eyelids, a sun for your private interior world. And the world outside, under its blanket of stars and snow, continued its own slow narration, a narration of tectonic shifts and orbiting moons, of creeping roots and sleeping animals. Your human story, with all its fragile ink, was just one paragraph in that eternal, breathing document. The silence of deep night was not empty. It was a presence, a soft pressure against the windows, held at bay by the lingering warmth of the hearth. And in that quiet, a change began, so gradual it was felt before it was seen. A faint, pearlescent glow seeped into the room. It did not arrive with the sharpness of dawn, but with the soft diffusion of light through cloud and snow. The world outside was no longer a black void, but a field of deepest blue. The stars were fading, their sharp pricks of light dissolving into the coming day. You awoke, not with a start, but with a slow return. The dreams, those deep-layer narratives, receded like water into sand. Their emotional echoes remained, a residue of feeling without plot. Your eyes opened to the grey ceiling, the room now visible in the new muted light. The fire was ash, a sculpture of soft grey and white, still holding the memory of its geometry. No flame flickered, but a profound heat radiated from its core. It had done its work through the long darkness, a quiet, steadfast companion. You rose, the blankets falling away, and went to the window. The sight outside made you breathe in slowly. The world had been rewritten in a single, silent syllable: snow. It lay over everything in a deep, unbroken blanket, rounding every edge, filling every hollow. The forest was a congregation of white-shrouded sentinels. The distant hills were softened into gentle curves. The sky was a seamless sheet of pale grey, the source of the light itself. All sound was absorbed, creating a hush so profound it felt like a new kind of hearing. This was the aftermath of the night's narration. The tectonic shift was not a quake, but this gentle, cumulative descent. The orbiting moon had pulled the clouds, and they had given up their burden. The sleeping animals were curled deeper in their burrows under this new insulation. You saw no tracks, not yet. The document of the night was pristine, a clean page. Your own story, you realized, was the only one poised to make a mark upon it. The thought was not a burden, but a quiet invitation, a choice presented in stillness. The cold of the floorboards seeped into your feet, a grounding sensation. It spoke of the world's enduring reality beneath the temporary transformation. The snow was a magnificent pause, but not the final word. The stone of the hearth still held its heat. The books on the shelf, their ink. You moved to rekindle the fire, taking a new log from the pile. Its bark was rough and cold in your hands. You placed it with care onto the hot ashes, the dry kindling catching almost immediately. A new flame was born, not from nothing, but from the legacy of the old. As the fresh fire grew, its light contested with the grey day. It cast warm, dancing shapes that felt ancient and familiar. This was the rhythm, the long, cold inhale of the night, the warm, crackling exhale of the hearth. You were the breath between them. Hunger arrived, a simple, uncomplicated signal. You went to the pantry, its shelves a testament of foresight. Jars of preserved fruit gleamed like captured summer. Grains rested in sealed containers. The simple act of preparing a meal became a ritual, a connection to the hands that had planted, harvested, and stored. The smell of cooking joined the scent of wood smoke. It was a humble, profoundly human aroma. It spoke of need and of the meeting of that need. You ate by the window, watching the white world, feeling the warmth of the bowl in your hands. And as you sat, you considered the idea of the collapse. The great institutional collapse the story spoke of. From this vantage, it did not look like ruins and chaos. It looked like this. It looked like a deep snow that simplified the landscape, that covered the old paths and forced a new awareness. It was not an end, but a covering, a blanket that allowed for a different kind of sleep, a different kind of dreaming for the world. What lay beneath was not gone. The fences, the roads, the foundations, they were all still there, sleeping, waiting. Perhaps the collapse was not an event, but a season. A long, quiet winter for the spirit of a noisy age. The institutions, like old trees, had grown brittle. The snow was a gentle force that encouraged them to shed their weight, or to simply rest. Your own life in this small holdfast felt like a single conscious breath within that long season. You were not fighting the winter. You were learning its grammar, the grammar of storage and conservation, of inward focus and sustained warmth. Finishing your meal, you dressed for the cold. The layers were a ceremony, each one a shield against the immense, beautiful indifference outside. Finally, You opened the door. The cold air rushed in, crisp and clean, scented of frozen pine and possibility. You stepped out into the new world. The snow came to your knees, a soft, crushing embrace. The silence was even more absolute here, broken only by the crunch of your own movements. Each step was a commitment, a slow, deliberate punctuation in the vast white sentence. You walked without a specific destination, simply making a path. Your breath plumed out before you, a transient ghost in the still air. You were the only moving thing in a painted landscape, and yet you felt no loneliness. You felt a part of the composition. You reached the edge of the forest and looked into its white colonnade. The shadows were blue and deep. A clump of snow, released from a high branch, fell with a soft whump. It was the only sound for minutes. This was the world's own heartbeat, slow and measured. Here, the idea of news from distant cities seemed not just distant, but irrelevant. What was the news of this place? The news was the quality of the snowpack. The news was the health of the sleeping trees. The news was the direction of the wind, still holding its breath. You thought of the library, of all the frantic words bound in leather and cloth. They were a record of a time when words were thrown into the air, like confetti, hoping to land in some significant pattern. Out here, words condensed, like your breath, into visible, fleeting shapes before fading. A single bird, a junco with dark feathers stark against the white, flitted between branches. It was a tiny, vital scribble of life. It found a seed head protruding from the snow and pecked at it. This was its story, immediate and essential. You turned and looked back at your path, a meandering line of broken snow leading to your door. It was the first mark on the page. It would not be the last. Others would come. Animals, the wind, more snow. The document was endlessly receptive. Returning was a different journey. You followed your own trail, seeing the details you'd missed, the impression of your knee where you'd paused, the spray of snow from a particular step. You were reading your own brief history, already being gently edited by the faint, persistent breeze. Back inside, you shed the cold outer layers. The fire welcomed you. The contrast between the outer stillness and the inner warmth was the story's central tension. It was the tension that sustained life. It was the reason for walls and hearths, for blankets and stored food. The day unfolded in this gentle polarity. Time was not marked by clocks, but by the slow march of shadow across the snow, by the settling of the fire, by the rising and falling of your own attention. You read. You mended a tool. You simply watched the flakes begin again, a lazy secondary descent. This was the pace of the collapse, a deceleration to the speed of growth and weather, a speed that allowed for observation, for true perception. The frantic hum of the past age was not a victory, but a sustained panic. This quiet was not emptiness, but a replenishment. As the early blue dusk began to bleed back into the sky, you felt no dread of the coming night. You had conversed with the day. You had listened to its long white sentence. You had added a few words of your own, in footprints and wood smoke. You prepared for the night. As a ritual partner, the lamps were lit, their light a smaller, more intimate promise than the fires. The world outside faded once more to a deep blue, then to black. The window reflecting the room back at you. You were not waiting for something to happen. The happening was the slow turn of the world, the gradual deepening of the cold, the steadfast persistence of the